So my wife Diane and I farm near Wolford, North Dakota, and Rolette County, Commerce County, and Pierce County, right where they all come together. And we've been farming there since 1993. My work with cover crops and soil health really is all about the soil. And one of the things that sometimes we don't see is the hidden degradation that's happened in our soil. So for example, the soil on the left-hand side there with that sharp line between the topsoil and the subsoil is actually from the field in the top right, which looks pretty good, but when you really get into it, it doesn't look so good. And of course, those of us across the state have seen this all too often. The field on the bottom left is the neighbor's field blowing, I believe it was in 2024, and losing tons and tons of topsoil off of a field that had been seeded to soybeans and then rock rolled, and it's no structure there. And so we've been trying to work on different ways to build our soils back up, and cover crops are one of the tools we use. Just some quick thoughts from a survey that was done of farmers. And one of the questions farmers always have, and that is, how is it going to pay back? And the way I look at it is pretty simple. This is like putting money into your IRA. It's something you chip in a little bit every year, and over time it grows. It isn't something to look at as I need to be paid back today for what I've invested into my soil. Now, the cost share programs that we just heard about are great, and they certainly help, but it really needs to have a long-term look at this. Establishment options, we'll talk a little bit about that, and I think there's been some good discussion on the fact that they don't impact negatively commodity crop yield performance generally. I think the other thing that really comes into this is how it fits into the whole system, and that's part of what I'm going to talk about, is how we've incorporated cover crops into our system. So this is a really nice slide that Marisol Verdi put together and shared with me some time ago. And when I talk about cover crops, I'm talking about the shoulder season. I'm not talking about a multi-species forage crop that's raised during the growing season, but rather things that put roots down or shoots during the spring season, and then things that may do the same in the fall. And then there's a couple of different planting cycles she's indicated on this, like for soybeans and corn, and I'm going to talk about that. My whole focus is on what's going on in the soil microbiome. And so arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi are one of my things that I really work on building in my soil. We do soil health analysis from time to time on our fields, and we see how well we're doing with that. We do raise a diverse bunch of crops on our farm, and so we get a lot of soil health buildup just from doing that. But in less diverse rotations, cover crops could be used to fill in some gaps, or in our case, we deliberately choose some of our crops, like field peas and oats, because as you can see in the far right, they're friendly to cover crops. We can get the field peas and the oats off usually by mid-August, and then have a good chance to get cover crops planted. Some of the other ones are much harder to do in terms of planting a cover crop post-harvest. The other thing I'm starting to focus on that we've missed, as we've always been about fall cover crops, I'm starting to try and work on how we can get spring cover crops growing to grow through the wintertime. So we started trying to plant cover crops in 2011, and we've tried a lot of different things. We've worked on, this is a particular picture of annual ryegrass, radish, and lentils. You see we have three species, plus, of course, the crop you're planting into is always a good volunteer crop. And some of the things that I can't do on our farm is I can't raise cereal rye because I have an oats contract, and it specifically forbids me using cereal rye or barley on our farm fields. Annual ryegrass I've tried as kind of a substitute for cereal rye. It grew really well. It's overwintered fairly well for me. I keep hearing horror stories from people who don't get a good kill in the spring, and so I'm always very cautious about how many acres I plant that have annual ryegrass in them. And just some of the roots that we get, from planting cover crops off of, this particular field that you can see here. I think one of the things that I try to remind people who are raising cover crops, particularly when they get them planted later, is they'll often look and say, gee, those things are only 3 or 4 inches tall and they froze, or 6 inches or whatever. It's like, did you dig it up? How deep are the roots? How big is the root mass? Because really in the fall season, we're not so much after top growth, we're after root growth. We're trying to feed that soil microbiome, keep that living root in the soil as long as we possibly can. And with the climate slowly changing in North Dakota, that's getting longer and longer into the year. In fact, this year, I planted some cover crops on October 3rd or 4th or something like that because forecast for the fall was generally warm and mild, and we had plenty of moisture in the soil. And so that cover crop grew and grew and grew until finally it got covered up with snow on November 25th. We've had some winter survival of species that necessarily aren't supposed to survive, like radishes. I've tried winter peas and triticale as a couple of other ones, to see if they'll get through the winter. And we've had, moderate success, maybe 25% survival rate for those. Winter peas are expensive. If the cost was cheaper, it'd be real easy to just throw a bunch of those into the mix and take what you can get. But they're fairly expensive seeds, so that one's kind of limited me, but we do try to put some in whenever we seed in the fall. I've tried a number of techniques of getting crops seeded. Obviously, a lot of just post-harvest seeding. We've tried aerial seeding a couple of different times, and the problem with that is moisture. If it doesn't rain after you've aerial seeded, the possibility of that germinating is pretty low. And on my fields, there seems to be enough insect activity that if it doesn't germinate after a month, it's gone. So even if it does rain, it's not coming. So then in 2018, it was like, okay, so aerial seeding isn't working very well. Let's go back to seeding it. And so there you can see a field we've seeded, and it was coming up nicely and had some good growth on it. And then on October 7th, it froze, and it froze hard. And so that cover crop that was just getting going, because it was so small, had it been taller, it might have survived better, but it was so small, it killed it all. And so we're back to a black field, which didn't make me very happy. So then I started looking at what are some other strategies? How can we get a cover crop growing in season? And this is actually some research work that Ezra referred to that he'd been doing down at NDSU Carrington earlier. And so this was some of his early study with barley, and it was pretty evident that we could try interseeding cover crops into our cereal grains without having an impact on yield. And so that was the next practice that I tackled, and we did a lot of different things with that over time. So in 2019, our first interseeding trials were clover with oats and wheat seed, and it worked pretty well. We mixed it in ahead of time because my air seeder could only handle it blended. I didn't have enough tanks to seed it separately. And we did get some growth. This was taken in must have been late July based on the crop there. We had kind of a dry year. And you can see the clover coming with the oats to the left and the wheat to the right. It did better in the wheat than it did in the oats. And I think some of that has to do with canopy and how aggressive oats can be in trying to suck up moisture. One of the challenges with interseeding is weed control. And these crops were interseeded at about the 4 to 5 leaf stage, or these were seeded with the seed, excuse me. But I've also done some later than that. But if they're seeded with the seed, like a clover with wheat or clover with oats, you have to be careful about what chemical you use for weed control, because a lot of their broadleaf herbicides we would use in those crops will kill the clover. There is a product that is licensed in Canada called Basagran. Those of you who raise field peas, dry beans may recognize that name. It's licensed for, again, for wheat in Canada, but not in North Dakota. It's one I would really like to get some help on. It obviously does not kill grass crops. And it only kills selective broadleaf crops. It would be a great tool to have for raising interseed and cover crops. In 2020, we interseeded a mix of cover crops, and I did some tile strips. You can see the dark green in the upper right corner, the northeast corner of this field, corresponds with the pink and the yellow in that corner, which is a tougher ground that doesn't yield quite as well as some of the other parts of the field. So I wanted to just do this trial. We put the herbicide on the July 23rd. And so that way we were able to get the cover crop seeded, and the herbicide wouldn't impact the cover crop seed because it still was just laying in the ground. And this is what it looked like. I used the Soil Conservation District's grass drill, and you would think that because this has coulters on the front and then a single disc opener. And when I looked behind me, I thought, oh my goodness, what am I doing to my crop? Because those coulters on the front were really making things black. But as it turned out, it didn't hurt the yields, and we did get some growth of those cover crops coming. This is in an oats field that we had done. And this is a different from 2022. I'm going to jump a little bit when we're talking about oats. I always wanted to see, I wanted to check Ezra's work. Okay, sorry, Ezra, on to see whether the yield actually declined or not doing this. So you can see the green and with red speckles, those are the strips that we planted into the cover crops. And then I had the gaps in between. So with my yield monitor, I could check and see across the field whether there was any impact on yield. And I did not see any impact on yield whatsoever from doing this research. But the other thing I wanted to see is there any positive soil impact to planting cover crops with the seed or in the crop? And particularly when you're using crops like lentils and buckwheat and field peas that we know have root exudates that stimulate microbial action. And so we went in on that, let me back up, on that trial strip up top there, and we sampled in the cover crop strips and in the no cover crop strips. And so in the control strip, what we saw shows up in the bottom left there is the total fungi value was 31.47. You can see the soil health rank there is very poor to poor. But in the cover crop strips, total fungi was 3 times as high at 107.1. And while not particularly great, we went from an F to a C minus. We were only below average once we planted the cover crops there. And we've done some more looking at this, and we are seeing a benefit to the soil health. And I think there was a comment made earlier about not seeing impact necessarily on higher N levels or P levels or whatever in a standard soil test. But if you can improve the soil microbial action, my belief is you're going to be giving those organisms a boost in helping the plant bring nutrients to them, like the fungus bringing the nutrients over to the roots. So I'm good with the concept of helping my plants and helping my microbes with the cover crops. So there's some examples. This was the cover crop and the oats that I was showing you. The trial looked great. That was, I think, the days we were taking those samples. Unfortunately, once again, the oats sprouted out the cover crops, and when I went to harvest that field, it was like, where are my cover crops? And I walked around and I looked, and there really wasn't anything other than in the low areas. The field on the upper right is the wheat field that we were planting, and this was tremendously successful. And when I was harvesting that, I thought, my goodness, why didn't I do the entire field instead of just doing a little bit of it? So that was really great to see all that cover crop coming. underneath, and that was the best success I've had. One of the things to mention in the bottom there, it talks about sunflowers, and we did do some pollinator plantings in sunflowers to see if we could get that same microbial impact. We did have microbial impact, but we also had a slight loss in yield in the sunflowers. And I learned never to use field peas as a sunflower interseeding, because the vines crawled up on the stalks and made a mess of the combine header when we were trying to combine. So if I ever do that again, there's not going to be any binding crops in it. And then this is just some examples showing the soil impact in those trials. So coming up in 2016 or 2026, excuse me, we're going to be doing something different. I mentioned oats and field peas give us a chance to get into the field fairly early and plant cover crops. But how about if we could get in even earlier? So last fall, I planted my second crop of winter camelina. And winter camelina will be harvested sometime mid to late July. So it'll be even a little bit earlier than those other two crops. And that gives me now a fairly long window to get the cover crops planted and growing. Now, this particular field happens to be adjacent to a pasture, and I've got a project going with Ducks Unlimited to basically redo something that my father used to do, which is aftergraze. That's what they always did, right? They after the crops were off in the fall, they turned the cows loose into the fields, let them graze the pastures or let them graze the wetlands or whatever volunteer crops coming. So we're going to do that deliberately. DU is helping pay for some extension of some water lines and tanks, as well as some of the fence put in. And this will give us an opportunity then to get a cover crop planted and hopefully get some grazing out of it in September sometime. This field was millet last year, so there's going to be millet residue. There might very well be some volunteer millet coming up as part of the cover crop next. I just want to point out some resources that I've used that you might find helpful when you're trying to figure out what to plant for cover crops. Green Cover Seed has a smart mix calculator, and you can put in what kinds of resources concerns you're there, what kinds of cover crops you think you might want to use, and all that kind of stuff. So just Google Green Cover Seed Smart Mix Calculator, and it'll take you to this page. You have to register, but it's free of charge, and it's a very useful tool. USDA ARS Center in Mandan, Northern Great Plains, has put together this cover crop chart. Another great one for just a quick visual of what kinds of cover crop species you might want to mix if you're looking for different things. So for example, after a pea crop, I'm going to have more carbon rich plants and some grassier plants in there, not so much in the way of broadleafs. But when I come after oats, then we're going to go with more of the legumes and the broadleaf crops, and not so much of the grassy crops, just for a simple comparison. And NRCS has a cover crop workbook that, even though you may not be in a CSP or an EQIP program, you can certainly reach out to your local conservation district, NRCS office, and see if they'll sit down and work through this table with you, where you can, again, put in some different resource concerns that you have, and it'll come up with a species mix for you. And then I've used this table a lot, where it offers you the names and then all the different things that you can do. So I'm typically shooting for 20 pounds and $20 an acre. If I was just to use a real simple rule of thumb. So in that 20 pounds, if you have just peas, obviously you're not going to have very many plants. But if you have just radishes, you're going to have way too many radishes. So you can go through and kind of pick out here, based on the seed count, what you want to have to mix in there to try to keep that cost in a reasonable frame. So just kind of in summary, our goal is to have lots of roots. We're feeding the microbial properties of the soil, whether it's fungus or bacteria or little insects or whatever are crawling around there. And then on the bottom right, where it talks about the cottage cheese soil texture. So that's what we're really after. And took some video. I wasn't sure if I had time for it, so I didn't include it in here, but took some video digging up soil this fall after about 6 inches of rain. And I went out there in late November and was doing some digging. And the soil, because I wanted some soil peat on, some bigger chunks of soil to use. And as I tipped the shovel up, it just crumbled. All of these, and you see the little crumbly things there in that picture, they just crumbled to pieces. The soil was wet, so if I squeezed it, I could make a ball of mud. But in its natural state, it was just really crumbly. And that's been my goal for a long time. I've been after this for 20 years. And I kept digging fields. I kept digging more and more. Is this real true? And other than some fields that have some issues, that's what we were finding. So I'm really happy with the work that we've been doing. This is when the IRA starts paying off, right? All those little chipping in a few bucks every year is paying off, but it takes time. So that's our goal. We're trying to build carbon-rich soil. You see on the left some examples of the microbial action. The bottom left one there is actually microfauna. That's I believe at 10 I can't even read that, but that's really zoomed in on a microscope. And then in the bottom, off to the right-hand side, that's a barn soil pedon that was taken from undisturbed soil on our farm. You can see that the topsoil is about 12 inches deep. That's about an 18-inch pedon there. And you see how that black soil just merges into the brown. There's no real hard transition line like I showed you in that first slide. And so this is the goal. And then in the middle is kind of where we are. We got most of our topsoils are now running 6 to 8 inches deep. There's no longer any line dividing topsoil and subsoil. It just flows from the next. And we have subsoil in our topsoil and topsoil in our subsoil that's been moved there by insects and worms and things like that. And it's really fun. So that's our legacy, the land. And that's what we've been working on for 20 some years. Thank you.